Welcome and thank you for joining us. This is Let's Go Deeper, a weekly podcast stream that offers a refreshing look at the Sabbath School lesson study through engaging conversation between myself, Joel Amenya,
and I, Pastor Inskip Allsup. In this podcast, we seek to distill meaningful insights from each week's lesson that will be both doctrinally sound and practical for your everyday life, as you unearth the great truths embedded in each week's lesson.
So welcome once again to this week's installment of Let's Go Deeper. Pastor, we are now moving into the seventh week, and number 7 being a perfect number. I'm interested to really see what we're going to cover in this lesson. And in this 7th lesson, the main topic is honesty with God. We want to really delve deep even to understand these terms. We don't want to assume that we already have an understanding of these words, however familiar they seem. So start us out by helping us see or understand the full scope of this word, honest.
Right. Honest is such a well-used word, We have honesty is the best policy, and people talk about being honest. Honest means to be straightforward, to be truthful, honorable. In other words, an honest person works without deceit. He's above board. He's full of integrity in word, in behavior, in his dealings with others. An honest person is someone who is fair, who is sincere. So when we talk about honesty, we are talking about something that is done in the open. There is nothing to hide. What you see is really what you get. And it is done on its own merit. I'm not seeking to gain anything. I'm not coming underhandedly. Whatever I'm doing is because I believe in this. It's on its own merit. So as we could see, honesty has to do with openness. You could trust me because what I bring to the table, there's no secret agenda. All of these words, all of these situations will encompass honesty. When you talk about somebody who is honest, it will involve all of these things: fairness, openness, without guile, without deceit, etc.
And that really opens us to a whole new paradigm of looking at this word honest.
Yes.
I know that the theme of this quarter's lesson is stewardship. How come honesty was not one of the hallmarks that were identified in last week's lesson? The hallmarks.
That's a good question. Because when we think about faithful, remember, faithful, trustworthy, obedient, with a clear conscience, all of these terms be encompassed in honest. And if I'm working with a clear conscience, if I'm faithful, if I'm trustworthy, if I'm obedient, if I'm loyal, then you could trust me. I will be sincere in what I do. I will do everything with good intentions. So honesty was incorporated in all these other characteristics that we mentioned for Stewart.
And those characteristics, I think one thing that kept coming up is that those are God-given characteristics. And I'm wondering, for honesty, is this a naturally occurring thing for people? Are people born honest? Are they dishonest? What is our natural state?
Our natural state is to be dishonest, because honesty implies openness, vulnerability even. I have no secret agenda. But in a world where everybody's trying to get ahead, where everybody wants what's best for him or her, then dishonesty became currency of interaction between human beings. Think about it. Two people who are falling in love, are they really honest when people are dating? No. We show our best side. The girl pretends she can cook, even though she's letting her mother do the cooking. The guy comes and he smiles and he makes her think that he's generous and kind. But after they get married, then you begin to see the real monster. So I'm saying we are naturally dishonest. Even children are born dishonest. Just look at a child who has done something wrong and lies. Nobody has to teach a child to lie. Just naturally recognizes, I'm in trouble. I need to do something to get out of trouble. No, it's not me. He has the cup of the water, but he said, I didn't throw water on the floor. So we are born dishonest. And by the way, just a plug here, parents, your duty is to nurture honesty in your children and discourage dishonesty by modeling honesty and also encouraging through precept what honesty is and helping your child develop it. Because the truth is, in a world where there is no honesty, it's a world in which there's going to be a lot of exploitation, a lot of hurt feelings, and a lot of destruction, as we see in politics even.
Yeah, and I remember a preacher once saying that the ultimate maturation of dishonesty is broken homes, is lost jobs, and ultimately it's people who don't actually know themselves because they have not only become dishonest to the outside world, but to themselves, to their own situation.
Let me tell you what happened to my father-in-law. He had worked for this company for over 30 years, had risen up to a supervisory position and had gotten to retirement age. Now, his company at that time, this is many years ago, when money had value, had owed him more than $100,000 that he would have received in cash. Bosses came and said, Mr. Joe, you're such a good worker. We need a man with your experience. Hold on for some more, please. Train somebody under you, whatever. Hold on. So he stayed and didn't take his money as he should have on retirement because he continued working. The very next year, within a year of him staying on, company shut down, went into receivership, and he lost every dime. He never got a dime from that company. And I believe those bosses knew they were planning to shut down the company, and they weren't willing to pay this guy all of this money, and maybe there were other workers that did the same thing too. That's what I'm talking about, dishonesty, where people come with a hidden agenda, where what I say is not really what I mean. And with that kind of stuff, you destroy people's hope, you destroy people's lives.
Yes, and now that you've taken us to this idea of money, I think we are discovering more and more that this is an area of needs to be very conscious of God's calling for us to be stewards. And I know that we, even within the church, within the body of believers, certain practices God has established for us to practice honesty with our money. What are some of the ways that we practice honesty with our money as believers?
The main area is with our tithe, which shows I'm being honest to God. It shows I recognize God as the giver of all things and that I owe my allegiance to Him. So the tithe becomes one of the great tests of honesty in the Christian. And what makes it a greater test of honesty is the fact that God doesn't snatch it from us. The government doesn't trust you, Joel. It doesn't trust me. It doesn't trust any American or any country doesn't trust its citizens. Why? Because they take your tax out before you get it. And then at the end of the year, they do an audit. You have to file your taxes and that kind of stuff. God says, no, I will give it all to you and you give it back to me. So that's one of the greatest tests of honesty, when I'm not being forced, when there's not a gun at my head and I'm doing the right thing.
So doing it out of personal conviction, out of personal volition, that this is the right thing to do in this moment with this resource.
Yes.
So to help us understand, because I know that Jesus is calling us, to be faithful in all ways, in all areas of our lives. And I know, for example, that Jesus puts Judas to be his treasurer, a dishonest individual, as many of us are, really. And in itself is a big test for Judas, which Judas ultimately failed. What are some of the ways in the church are we struggling with being faithful in this way of giving?
Like I said in the last lesson, we should all read that chapter, Judas and the Desire of Ages, because Ellen White really goes in and shows what was happening to this man. But one thing that I found very interesting, now John chapter 12 verse 6 says Judas was a thief. But Ellen White does an interesting exposition. She says he was a thief in that he paid himself for his efforts and what he was doing on behalf of the group. So if he did some activity, he would say, well, this would be worth so much. And therefore, he was actually sort of paying himself from the till. But the problem with Judas is that he was in a volunteer position, but he treated it as a salaried position. And there are many people in church who do that today. For instance, they put me in charge of the food bank. And I decide, I'm working so hard in this food bank, getting the food. I need to take more food for myself. So I take the best of the food, take more of it, and I stack it away because I am working hard. Or I'm in charge of the church building, and I use the phone and I use the internet, all of these privileges that are not open to me because I'm telling myself, because I'm working so hard. When we do that, we abuse positions of authority, privilege, and access. We are being dishonest. We are showing the same Judas spirit. There are people who work for the church, but they always skim from the top. Even on your job, if you're skimming from the top, you are being dishonest. For instance, they may say, Joel, we would like you to be in charge of the program that's coming up, and you may have to drive back and forth, up and down, and you decide, from the money they gave you to buy stuff, I'm going to take some of this money to buy gas because I'm using my car back and forth. No, that is dishonest because this is a volunteer position, not a salaried position. Any payment for efforts put out or monies that you spend should be agreed upon by those who put you in this position that you could pay for your gas or whatever have you. If not, is dishonest. So the question that every Christian has to ask himself is, how do I act when I am in a position of privilege, authority, or access? Do I abuse it? Do I take more for myself? Do I believe it gives me the right to take from me because I'm in this position? If you tend to do that, you are nurturing the spirit of dishonesty.
Wow. And so privilege, authority, access, are things we should be looking at from our, from within ourselves and seeing how are we being, honest towards in those things.
Yes.
And much more so now with our finances, because I think the lesson tries to really press in on the idea of tithing. Why is it an important practice for Christians?
Good question. Let me read something Ellen White says in in Education, page 138. This is on Sunday's lesson. She says, no appeal is made to gratitude or to generosity, talking about the tithe. This is a matter of simple honesty. What she says, it's a matter of simple honesty. The tithe is the Lord's, and he bids us return to him that which is his own. If honesty is an essential principle of business life, must we not recognize our obligation to God, the obligation that underlies every other? I think that encapsulate what should be our attitude towards returning tithe to God and how we should treat our money. It belongs to God, and honesty would demand that we return to him that which is his.
So for a Christian who is struggling, I'm maybe making so little, and it seems that whatever I have is not sufficient to meet the end, to meet the needs that I have, the very immediate, the very basic need. Where do I get that conviction, that confidence to still give tithe? Or do I only give tithe when there is sufficient to cover what I have, then give the tithe?
Good question. You see, tithing acknowledges God and my allegiance to him. It could be an act of faith, or it could represent a life of faith. You mentioned that person whose income is low and maybe can't really stretch as much as he needs it to normally. Now, if this person, in an acknowledgement of God's goodness, of God's rights over who I am and what I have, decides, Lord, I will be faithful to you and return to you your tithe, and faithfully does that every month or every pay period, as the case might be, he is living a life of faith. Now, some of us in a given moment may decide to give your tithe. Maybe it's just a sermon and that impresses you, and on that week you give it. That may be an act of faith. You see, somebody can do something faithful in a moment. I call that an act of faith without living a life of faith, which is a constant growing trust and dependence upon God. So in your scenario, it may be that Sabbath morning, the preacher said, trust me. The Lord said, trust me. And you're thinking, man, I don't have enough money. But the sermon touches you and you give at that moment. That could be an act of faith. But if you're consistently giving, then it shows you're living a life of faith. But quickly, let me say this. Tithing can be done without there being faith.
Also,
because we have the tithe, the scribes and Pharisees. Jesus said the tithe in Matthew 23 says you tithe mint and dill and cumin. In Luke 11:42, he says the same thing. He says, this ought you to have done and not leave the other undone. Justice and mercy and righteousness. So Christ is saying you are tithing, but you're not living a life of faith and trust and righteousness. In another place in Matthew 23, verses 5 and 6, he says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. He says, because you eat widows. He said, you eat widows' inheritance, and yet for pretense you give long prayers. So these same scribes and Pharisees who were tithing faithfully, abusing, exploiting widows. Another time Jesus says, you have no faith. So my point is, they were giving, tithing, scrupulous, but there was no faith and trust in God in what they were doing. In another case, Jesus looked in the temple. This is in Mark chapter 2, I think it is, when he saw the widow. And he said to his disciples, all of these are giving of their excess, but she, from her need, is given. She was demonstrating a life of faith by giving her very last, even all she had. These other guys who were given a whole lot of money were given from their excess.
Yeah, and I think that will bring us to a very interesting idea that we need to go into. But before that, if I'm correct, I think the point you're making is that there are ways in which we can actually be tithing, but using that as a method of procuring God's blessings and God's goodness rather than as an act of faith and trusting God.
Yes, and not only that, the very fact that I can tithe means I had to receive. I had to have had something come in.
Yes.
And there are people who recognize that, hey, I've been blessed. I got a promotion on my job. I'm working well. Let me give my tithe to keep on good terms with God. But it's still from the excess. Because even after they paid their 10% or whatever they give, there's still a whole lot of money still left. After that, they buy their fancy cars to build their 5-bedroom houses, etc. So tithing must not be seen for more than it is. And I know the lesson sort of implies that tithing is all about faith and trust and stuff like that. For it says that God will finish our faith. And one way of doing that is through tithing. Tithing acknowledges my obedience, my allegiance to God, and it can be the expression of a life of faith. But far too often, it is simply a religious duty done to placate God, to look good among the brethren, to pay our membership dues, so to speak, in our church. But it doesn't come from a faith and trust in God. Simply because we are working, we have enough, and even after we give, there's still a whole lot of money left over.
Very, very interesting, and I think very important points to be made there. And you mentioned earlier this idea of an act of faith versus a life of faith. What is wrong with, being a sporadic giver who trusts in these act of faith events rather than life of faith? What is the big difference there, and what is the big, value in practicing life compared to acts?
Acts of faith, because they're sporadic, they're spontaneous, usually caused by some external stimulus, are unreliable. They do not develop the character and ongoing trust that grows a deep relationship with God. So Balaam gave a great prophecy, the Messiah. He spoke blessing to Israel, but it wasn't of faith. It wasn't a life of faith. He was coming to make money. But under the overpowering influence of the Holy Spirit, he spoke righteous words. There are many people who in a given moment, moved by circumstances, by a message, whatever have you, can do something faithful. The danger of acts of faith is what happens with Ananias and Sapphira. Barnabas had sold his property and brought it to the apostles. The Christians were giving of their wealth and say, let's share. We all have. And in that environment, they decided, let's sell our property and bring to the church. That was an act of faith. However, because it wasn't prompted by a life of faith, of trust and dependence, when they saw how much money they got, recognized, are we going to give all of this to the apostles? They decided to keep back some, and it destroyed their souls. The problem with acts of faith is that they make you think you are growing in faith, that you are growing in trust, when you really are not. And in the crucial moment, you need to hold on to God and His promise. You don't. Abraham becomes a perfect example. Abraham lived a life of faith. From the moment he left his home to follow God's promise, there was complete dependence upon God, and we see his faith growing. Now, a man of faith can doubt, can fall, as we see Abraham did when he lied about Sarah being his sister, not telling people the full truth. She's my wife. We see Abraham wavering when he decided to go with Hagar and have a son and not keep trusting God that a son will come through Sarah. But in all of that, we see Abraham following God, Abraham seeking to stay faithful to God. And in that crucial moment, when God told Abraham, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, offer him for me, Abraham did not waver. He did it because his was a life of faith. A life of faith is one that grows and grows.
And the practice builds on itself.
It builds on itself.
Yeah.
And what you do today would be pale in comparison to what you'll do tomorrow if it's a life of faith.
Yeah, and it so seems to me then that this life of faith, this idea of practicing and continually being faithful through tithe is actually being proactively faithful or proactively practicing your faith as compared to acts of faith which are much more reactionary.
Right, yes, I like how you put it that way, more reactionary, based on the stimulus of the moment, a sudden inspiration, wave of inspiration. But a life of faith is deliberate. It's constant and it grows. And that's something that you don't see happening a lot. And so there are people who give tithe, but your offering never grows. It's always just a little dollar, that you just throw in the basket. Because this is a life of faith that keeps growing and trusting. And your trust becomes greater. So it doesn't matter what happens. You would give even your life for God because you know you're in safe hands with Him.
Wow. So in here, it seems to me then that God has hidden a resource, or even rather a pathway for us really becoming for faith in such a profound way.
Yes, and in its essence, really, Joel, I keep telling you about the three tithes. The Israelites didn't just give 10%. They gave up to as much as 24%, something up to 30%, because there were three tithes. Like on the third year, there were three tithes. But even then, that wasn't enough. God still enjoined the Israelites, take care of the poor and the needy, the widows and the orphan. He told them, when you're reaping and you're harvesting, don't glean your fields. Don't go all to the edges. Don't leave some for the poor. But as a soft heart, by the way, people, for the poor and the needy, those who can't help, who can't return the favor. And when Jesus comes, He says, when you're having a party, invite your friends who can invite you back. Invite those who can't invite you back, who have nothing to give you. He says, when you're helping, don't help those who can give you back. Like what we do, Christmas and Thanksgiving, we invite our friends. Oh, this year we eating by you, next year you come by me. Or we buy gifts. Oh, I can't buy that gift because she bought an expensive gift last year. No. To truly eradicate selfishness and to make it a life of faith, God always places in our midst people with immediate needs that we can fulfill, but it would mean dipping in our pockets, even beyond the tithe. And the scribes and Pharisees never did that.
So it's almost to give it a positive spin that God places in our midst people who can help us practice our faith.
Yes.
So I just want to step back a bit to what you said earlier about the widow and how much she gave, and even now mentioning the Israelites and how they gave it upwards of 20-30%. I think many times when we hear the word tithe, we connect it with 10%. How much is sufficient, or how much of a percentage of what we make, or our earnings, or our income, our resources, do we give for tithe? What is this bar for that? Is there a bar for that?
Yes and no. Yes is, God said, all the tithes belong to me. Leviticus 27:30. All the tithes belong to me. So that's your minimum. That's your baseline. From there, it could go to 20%, 30%. It could get to 50%. It could even go to the percent of all. Like the widow, Elijah came. Remember that widow?
Mm-hmm. With the flour and oil.
He says, you make for me. And she said, but all I have is enough for me and my son to eat this and die. He said, no, you give me and then God will take care of you. Wow. That is no tithe. That is all. The widow that Jesus talked about. He said she gave her last, everything she had. What I'm saying is, Joel, 10% is a minimum. Adventist, 10% is a minimum. Now beginning to exercise faith when you give 10%. That's baby faith. That's milk faith. That is just beginning faith. When you go beyond that, then we are stretching into the area of trusting God. And when we go beyond that, now we are saying, Lord, all I am and have is yours. Yes. And I'm trusting you that as I have helped, as I've done that which was around me to do, as I've fulfilled needs with the resources you've given to me, you will keep providing, because the righteous will never be forsaken or his seed begging bread. You can provide all my needs. Your cattle on 1,000 hills are yours, the silver and gold are yours. You will take care of me. You can't take care of me. That is a place many of us, far too many of us, have never even seen nor come to.
So because when I look around and see how, the culture we live in is set up, we see people who have a lot of resources put back and saved out for future expectations or future plans. Many a times as a believer, if you come across and need some help, somebody will tell you, I really don't have money. But if you really did an audit of their lives, they have a big chunk of money saved somewhere for some future plan to buy a house, to buy a car. How far should we go in giving from our resources? How deep should we dive?
Wow, what a question, Joel. And I think only God can determine that. And that's why he will place people in our pathway at strategic moments to reveal how deep we should go. For instance, if I came to you, you have, let's say, $60,000 in the bank. You're thinking, in a few years, I want to buy a house. I'm putting my down payment down and to get some things done. And you have a nice little nest egg for the future. I'm in a deep situation right now. My car just shut down on me. It was an old car. The engine just blew up. And I need help. When I come, I say, Brother Joel, I'm coming back and forth, and you know how the situation is. Could you please help me get an engine? I need $2,000. You say, Pastor, man, I wish I could help you, but I really don't have. You may think you're being honest because you're thinking in your mind, I really don't have disposable income. I know I have money in the bank, but that's for the rainy day. That's my nest egg for the next few years when I retire. Well, guess what? You're not truly being honest. You're still showing a love of mammon. You're still showing that you don't trust God because you are turning your back on present urgent need for some future plan. And it reminds us of the rich fool when he said, okay, soul, you have laid up for you, take a rest. And God said, okay, yes. And whose will that be? Because tonight your soul is required. I am saying, and this is not for me to force this on anyone. Each one has to come to this point. But what I've been inspired as I've studied this is that at that moment, there's a test for you and for me. I still trust that the God who brought me this far knows what's going to happen 2 years down the road and can provide for me then. That this God who has allowed this person to come into my pathway at this moment, who sees me given in an act of sacrifice and love, providing a present need, that this is a real present, legitimate need, that he doesn't know that 2 years down the road I'm going to need this money, that he can provide. Who's to tell me that 2 years down the road or 5 years down the road I will have that money? We see how the economy is. stock market, how it fluctuates. Look at Enron. All those people with their savings in Enron disappeared. All those people with their money with Bernie Madoff in one night, gone. So even as you're saving your money in these banks, you have no clue. So many banks had a run on when the economy crashed in 2008 in England, in Greece. My point is this: only security we have is in Jesus Christ as we trust him. And every day we are being placed on that platform of trust or doubt, a life of faith or occasional acts of faith, or simply act in the normal. Yes, I know when I get my salary, I give my tithe and a couple dollars offering, and I've done my part, and now the rest is mine, or all that I am and have is God's. That's the challenge.
Pastor, thank you very much. And this lesson of honesty on God with God seems to be so loaded and rich. And I think we're gonna do a second part of this lesson, because I think there's still much more for us to go into.
Yes, there's so much more. Yes,
you know, the idea that tithe is not expressly mentioned in the New Testament. How do we wrestle with that, and how do we come to conclude that still tithe is relevant? So we'll do that in our second part. So, Pastor, we are doing the second part of Lesson 7, and we ended the first part really on this idea of tithe being more than 10%, and you made the statement that 10% is the minimum, it's the baby step towards growing our faith by even giving much more. And just going into what Jesus said about faithful, and he makes the statement that whomever is faithful in the least is faithful the great. And I'm trying to see how does this match up with this with position that 10% is the starting point.
Imagine you're working, you're getting a salary every month, every week, whatever have you, and yet you find it hard and difficult to return 10% to your maker, the one who has given you the strength to make wealth, as Deuteronomy 8:18 says. Well, 10% being just the minimum, it means then that God cannot trust you to do greater things for him, greater exploits of sacrificial giving and caring, as the Macedonian church that had this grace of giving, Paul says, that begged to give even from their needs. I'm saying, if you're not faithful with that simple salary, how could God trust you with more wealth, more resources to do even greater work for him? I'm also reminded about this person who was sentenced to 7 years for stealing $100. And somebody said, $100, and they would give a man 7 years? I said, yes, because stealing $100 is the same as stealing $100,000. It's the same principle. You see, honesty and dishonesty is not about quantity. It's a spirit. It's an attitude. It makes me remember that parable Jesus says in Matthew 13:31 and 32, where he says, the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. And when it is planted, it's the smallest of seeds. When it grows, it's the largest of shrubs. Well, guess what? Dishonesty or honesty is like a seed that must be planted. When it is planted in the soil, which would be the opportunities to express it, to demonstrate it, then it will grow. So if you're dishonest with something small, a small responsibility, as opportunities keep coming your way, that seed is getting watered and nurtured. It's going to sprout to greater dishonesty. So my point is this: if someone finds it difficult to be honest with God in the minimum, that 10% that he says is mine, then there's no way we will be faithful to God when there are great opportunities to do good.
So you're saying that if I'm not being able to be faithful with what is little, that same nature is bound to expand and sort of multiply out as opportunity increases.
Yeah, if it grieves me to return to God that which is his, it's going to grieve me even more to give to my brother or my sister, as we mentioned just now in part 1 about the person who says, I really wish I could help you, but they've got $50,000 in the bank for future use, even while looking at you suffering right now. Is the same attitude and spirit. And so tithing is only an antidote against selfishness and self-centeredness if it is combined, and this is important, if it is combined with sacrificial giving, disinterested giving, and caring for others.
How do we know deep within ourselves that we are moving into a place where we are sacrificially giving and not a place of just giving so that we can merit some favor, merit some,
or just barely doing our duty, just barely doing the minimum.
Exactly.
As that parable Jesus gave of the servant who, when the master came back from the field. When he came back from the field and the master asked him to share his food out, he says, I am an unprofitable servant. I have only done that which was required. That parable in Luke chapter 17 is such a key parable for us today. Here's a servant who goes out into the field, does his work out in the field, comes back home. His master says, servant, I need to eat. Bring me some food. The servant brings the food to the master and then says, I am an unprofitable servant. I have only done that which was required. So what I'm talking about here, Joel, is about you and I only doing what is required and not doing more as we see the need in front of us to do more. And that is the key, to do more when I see the need in front of me. There are times you get impressed, you get touched in your heart. I should do something here. That sister, she's been coming to church and I could see that things are tough with her, I could see her car looks like it's giving her some trouble. Or that coat she has on, it looks really raggedy. And you feel touched. At that moment, you say, man, I wish I could probably buy her a coat or maybe help her with her car. And then at that moment, you think, nah, because, I have that little money that I'm saving for the future, or I want to go on my cruise next year, whatever have you. At that moment, that's where the rubber meets the road. And so, if we really want to have that selfishness eradicated from us, that self-centeredness, and to truly trust God in these moments of challenge, when our consciences and our hearts have been touched, we need to, by faith, just go out and give.
And so, because you make a case there that we will be driven to give when we see a need. And I know there are many Christians who find themselves maybe in churches or in spaces where they may not necessarily see a need. There is no need that is visible to them. How are those Christians? What will inspire them? What will drive them to give more? How should they find that impetus to give more from their wealth,
Honestly,
or their resources?
Joel, we are talking about honesty with God. Honestly, Joel, there is no Christian who could genuinely tell me he doesn't see need in his environment. On his way driving to work, on his way driving from work, on his way to church, on his way from church. There's need in church. Even on TV, sometimes we have ADRA sends out their letters, talking about Africa and different places where ADRA is working. Quiet Hour sends out their letters telling you about crusades and people they are helping parts of the world. We look on TV, Samaritan. There's always need.
And so I guess the point I'm making is, should a Christian sit back or at least just wait for need to emerge, or should a Christian look out for where need is to serve?
Ooh, now we're taking it a whole new level. Jesus Christ said, the Son of Man, Luke 19:10, came to seek and to save the lost. The woman at the well, Jesus went looking for her. He actually didn't have to pass where he went. The Holy Spirit led him there. So how, Joel, you touched me with what you just said. Maybe that's part of the problem. We are hoping for need to come, just as we hope people will come to our church and then evangelize them. But we can go out and look for need, because there's always needs. You could just go to any homeless shelter, go to any village in Wilmington, any ghetto in your city, and you will see need. Just look at your neighbor. So maybe we should have our eyes looking for those needs and say, Lord, lead me to that person. Maybe when we pray in the morning, it could be like, Lord, there's somebody I could help today. Lead me to that person. There was a time I started walking with extra dollars in my car just to meet those people on the street when they, you meet them just to put out that $1, that $5, without asking questions. So maybe we need to have a new attitude. Lord, like the Macedonians, they begged to give. They said, please let us give. I know things are tough here in Macedonia. We don't have a lot. But from what we have, we want to give. We want to help. Maybe that should be our attitude.
Yes, and that's really what I'm trying to get us to, because I think we live in a society where unless we see a need, unless that is obvious to us, then we don't think there is a need. When really somebody just across the pond, just over the wall is suffering and needs our assistance.
And even when we see need and we are being asked to fulfill that need, it is always done in a that it doesn't hurt way. You've seen those commercials. For the price of just a cup of coffee, you can help a child go to school for a week. You've seen it. In other words, give, but it mustn't hurt. I'm not saying we need to give till it hurts in the sense of you're giving and you start to feel oppressed and you start to feel exploited and you begin to get depressed. No. I'm not talking about that kind of giving. I'm talking about really fulfilling a need when you know you can. For instance, I tell people, when the resources are limited and the needs are great, give your resources where it will do the most good. So if you meet a guy who needs $100, a guy who needs $50, and a guy who needs $10, and all you have is $10, give the guy who needs $10. At least that's one guy you've helped. Some Christians would say, okay, maybe I could change up my $100, give this guy 20, give this guy 20, give this guy 20. So you feel good. I helped 3 people. We didn't help anybody because none of them could fulfill their need. So what I'm saying is, if you give each person, no, what I'm saying, if you put your resources where the need is greatest and where you can do the best good, that is what God wants you to do. Always fulfill the need that is at hand, that you can fulfill to the best of your ability. And sometimes it may mean dipping into those resources that you have stashed away for some future plan.
So it seems to me then, now we have even to wrestle with this question of, is then giving, maybe because the argument that is made many times by people even about the New Testament is that tithe is not expressly mentioned as a number, as a figure, that it's giving out of a generous heart. How do we come to terms with the reality that tithe still has a number to it, even in the New Testament dispensation?
That's an interesting question, because it is true that tithing is not enforced, it is not mentioned in a direct commanding way in the New Testament as it is in the Old. I believe it is because it was one of those it goes without saying situations. Remember, like the Sabbath, there's nowhere in the New Testament where we are told to keep the Sabbath, but everybody was keeping the Sabbath. What we are told is how to keep the Sabbath. So Jesus, at no point he tells the scribes and Pharisees, you shouldn't keep Sabbath. He says, no, you shouldn't keep Sabbath that way. So that was one of those, it goes without saying, we are all keeping the Sabbath. You never see in the New Testament any command that says don't eat unclean meats, because that was one of those, it goes without saying, we are all eating the proper foods, but Jesus now saying put food in its proper place. I believe tithing is like that. We see tithing in the Old Testament before Sinai, before Israel came out of Egypt. We saw it in Abraham, we saw it with Jacob, and in both cases it was a response of honesty in Abraham, where he gives to Melchizedek, and he wouldn't take a dime. He said I wouldn't even take a shoelace from Chedorlaomer, the king. He says, no, I don't want you to say you made me rich. My God is the one who is making me rich.
Is tithing also could that be the same thing attributed to Abel's sacrifice?
I wouldn't want to go that far with it, but it could be, because again, it could be a case where God is saying to Abel and to Cain, the fruit of the ground is mine, flocks are mine, and your salvation depends upon me. So in bringing an offering, you're acknowledging my grace, my goodness, your salvation, and that I'm the one who's working this out. And the tithe could be something that developed from that, of recognizing God. But at least the specific mention of tithe would be Abraham, that's the first mention, giving to Melchizedek, and to Jacob, saying, Lord, Genesis 28, if you would really do this for me, take me safely to Haran and get married and come back prosperous, I will give you the 10th of all I have. So we see it was a response of gratitude, of acknowledgement of God, you are the one doing this for me. Now after that, the next mention of tithe would be now in the ceremonial laws given to Israel, where it is now codified as a system with God specifying the tithe should go to my Levites, who I have given no inheritance but the temple and what it produces. And all around the Old Testament, Israel is paying tithe, giving tithes, and doing all of this. So in the New Testament, when Jesus comes on the scene, they're still giving tithe. And he doesn't deny that. He says, this ought ye to have done, not leave the other undone. So I'm suggesting that the reason we don't see tithe being commanded in the New Testament is because it was one of those, it goes without saying, we are all tithing. And Jesus is giving the context that tithing without justice and mercy is useless. That tithing without kindness and generosity is useless. The next mention of tithing in the New Testament we see in Hebrews chapter 7, 9 through 12, where Paul making a comparison between Levi, who he says was in the loins of Abraham, paying tithe Melchizedek, and Christ being a high priest after Melchizedek, showing that Christ's high priest is way beyond the Aaronic priesthood, just as the lesser pays tithe to the greater. And so when Levi in Abraham's bosom and loins, so he paid tithe to Melchizedek, he's acknowledging a greater priesthood. And then it says, with a change priesthood comes a change of law. And many Christians use that text as a key text. They say, look, in a change of priesthood, there's a change of law because tithing was mentioned. That may be taking it too far. So in that sense, there's no mention of tithe in the New Testament as a command. And I believe, like I said, it was those, it goes without saying we are all tithing. However, the What we do see in the New Testament is a new paradigm of giving that goes beyond tithe. And sadly, most people who say the New Testament doesn't mention tithe are usually those who want to give less than the minimum, as I mentioned. For instance, in 1 Corinthians 16:2, Paul says, let each one of you give on the first day of the month, let each one of the week, let each one give according as his income and laid by him, so that when I come, there will be no collecting. In that instruction, we see there should be methodology, regularity, there should be proportionality, giving. Paul says, let each one, so there's an individual, laying by him, you prepared it, it's methodical. The first day is regular, every first day of the week, so that when I come, according to his income. So Paul is saying, give as you are able. Then we know 2 Corinthians 9:6, that famous text, says the liberal heart shall be watered. He who sows sparingly will reap sparingly. He who sows bountifully will reap bountifully. And then Paul says something else. He says, let each one give as he's convinced in his heart, not by coercion. So we see in the New Testament, Paul is saying, in the Old Testament, the tithe was commanded. There are many people giving the tithe as a command, like the scribes and Pharisees. You're tithing mint and dill and coming. You're very exact because God must see I'm being faithful. He says, no, don't give us an obligation. Just like Sabbath keeping, don't keep Sabbath as an obligation. He says, give with a cheerful heart and give bountifully. So bountifully. So in the New Testament, the paradigm of giving is give as much as you can, as often as you can, the best spirit that you can.
And essentially meaning over and above whatever is, the minimum. The minimum was identified initially as the 10%.
Yes.
So you mentioned earlier that, we should give tithe out of all our resources. You said Abraham and Jacob did the same. For a modern Christian who lives in the 21st century, the way we look at our resources is our salary, our income. Is that the full extent of what we are giving as tithe? Is that the limit of what we can give as tithe? Or there's more in us or in our experiences that we can give as tithe?
Okay, since in biblical times, the economy was agricultural, and it would be like livestock, it would be like grain and stuff like that. In our economy, in our 21st century world here, it is about dollars and cents. We work for somebody, they pay us a salary. We invest, we get interest back, right? We have a business, we make a profit. And so the tithe is of your increase, right? So I'm saying we should tithe of all streams of income. That may be the best way to put it. All streams of income. Some people say you should pay on the gross. That is your salary before Uncle Sam dips his hand in your pocket. Some people say give your tithe according to your net. What comes actually in your hand, that is your increase, what actually comes in your hand. Some people say if you get a gift, like if I should say, hey, Joel, I was thinking about you. Here's $100. You should tithe from that. Some people say, no, that's not my increase. That is not like what I've toiled and given. Some people say anything you get is your increase. In this case, I think Paul's counsel may be best. He says each one give as he has proposed in his heart, as he's convicted in his heart, as to whether every dime you get, you need to tithe it, or whether it's of your increase, like your salary, etc. And I do believe if you're working, but you have an investment or you have a business on the side, any stream of income that comes into your hand should be tithe.
Wow, that then puts us on a whole different platform in terms of how we look at what we are supposed to tithe with. So, Pastor, I think we're going to be coming to the end of week 7, and it's really been very eye-opening in many ways to understand this idea of tithe a bit more, even for myself personally. And I'm wondering now, help us understand in the grand scope of the gospel, how does our practice of tithing help the mission of the gospel?
Jesus says in Matthew 10:10, the worker is worthy of his hire. And he sent out his workers. He says, don't carry any extra shoes, don't carry any extra clothes, don't even carry bread in your pouch. He said, because wherever you go in, and in Luke, he repeats the same instruction. He said, wherever you go into that house, receive what they give you, because the worker is worthy of his hire. He says, don't take extra because you deserve to be taken care of by those you minister to. Paul says it the same way in 2 Corinthians 9. He says, which soldier goes to fight of his own accord? He says, no, when a soldier goes to fight, there's a government backing him, giving him a salary, taking care of his needs. He also says, you don't muzzle the ox that treads the grain, showing that if the ox is treading the grain, allow you to eat, why should you prevent him from eating? And Paul also says, he says, if we eat If you eat of our spiritual good, shouldn't we eat of your material good? That being said, there are still prophets and apostles and preachers and teachers, evangelists, whose lives are dedicated to the gospel, that God has called to dedicate themselves fully to the gospel. So that while you're doing a 9 to 5 at Bank of America, you're doing a 9 to 5 at Verizon, doing a 9 to 5, wherever you might be working, there's a minister studying the word, visiting, praying, planning, holding up the congregation before God. Any needs, he is there to visit the sick, etc. His life is dedicated to ministering to your spiritual needs and a congregation. God says, just as you deserve to eat, my servant deserves to eat. When you work for the state pays you. And my servant works for me, I pay him. And how do I pay him? Through the tithes that you give to the system. So when we tithe, we are really keeping the gospel out there. Question becomes, where should you tithe? It's a storehouse. As Seventh Adventists, we accept that the storehouse would be the Seventh Adventist church, the conference you live in. You give it through your church to that conference where you live in. I know some people may live in America and send your tithe back to Africa, send your tithe back to Grenada, send your tithe back to wherever. I think that is unfair, because where you eat is where you need to support. I don't think it's fair for a Christian who comes to church here in my church, in your church, where I'm ministering to you, where I'm helping you, where you feed spiritually and encouraged by my ministry, and yet take your resources and send it to another country. I don't think that is fair. I'm not saying you can't send an offering, but you should support where you are being fed. So your tithe should go to the conference, to the church where you are being nurtured spiritually. Beyond that, we go into a polemic that this is probably not the area of it, but I must say this though. A faithful steward is faithful not only in giving, but in being sure that he is giving to the right cause, that this money is doing what it was supposed to do. Not a good steward if you simply give and don't care what is being done with it. That's not being a good steward. So I would encourage every faithful giver to be sure that that money is being used to preach the gospel, to further the gospel, keep the word of God going and the kingdom of God alive and well in this world. If not, there are only two kingdoms in this world. And if you're not building up God's kingdom, you're definitely building up the other kingdom. So with that in mind, then, remember this. In the New Testament, God says, I'm not stipulating as strictly as in the Old Testament what you should give. But that is a minimum that belongs to me. You can't go below that. However, in the New Testament, because of the greater blessings, the greater revelation, give as much as you can, as often as you can, as cheerfully as you can, to as many as you can, to bless and to alleviate as many as you can. And then you will truly be eradicating the selfishness, self-centeredness, and covetousness that is a natural part of your human nature, and instead replacing it with true love and godlikeness.
A wonderful way to end it. As I think that will be a good place for us to end. Thank you so much for sharing with us. And we look forward to moving on to week 8 in our next episode.
Yes. And so, Father, we tend to be so dishonest in so many ways, sometimes even with you. And for those of us who have been stingy, who have been given but grudgingly, forgive us, Lord, and open our eyes and minds to see the many blessings that are pouring down from you and why we can trust you. For those of us who would love to give more but we are timid, give us the kind of faith of Abraham. Live a life of faith that says, my Heavenly Father watches over me and you will take care. And for those of us who are still stuck on the minimum, enlarge our faith, Lord. May we plant our faith like that mustard seed and then see it grow until, like Paul and those, we can say, I've given all to the gospel. What a reward we'll have when Christ comes and takes us to that wonderful home in which anything we have on this earth will pale in comparison. And how sweet to hear those words from Jesus. Well done, good and faithful servant. I want to hear those words. May my listeners also hear those words. Amen.
Amen. We are glad you were able to join us for this episode of Let's Go Deeper. We would love to hear from you. Please send us your feedback or questions to letusgodeeper@gmail.com. That is letusgodeeper@gmail.com. Or you can leave us a voicemail on phone number 302-440-4068. You can also find us on Twitter at Let Us Go Deeper. This podcast is available on the iTunes Store, Play Music on your Android, SoundCloud, or wherever you stream your podcasts. Please check back every Sunday for a new episode of Let's Go Deeper.